everyone, it is good to be back. Solaria here again, and we're back with podcast number 2. This podcast is going to be about D&D! I have a general roadmap of where I want this episode to go, but before I get into that, I wanted to say thank you, everybody, for all your support on podcast number 1. I got a lot of awesome feedback, had people tell me what a great job I did, how awesome they thought it was, and how they really enjoyed it, and that really made me happy and warmed my heart, so I was very much looking forward to doing podcast number 2 and getting back to it. Alright, well, let's just jump right in. Our first item on the agenda is talking about my involvement with D&D. So I've been playing D&D since 2017 in June. I started with something called Pathfinder, and I'll go into the details of Pathfinder versus D&D, at least in some capacity, in a minute. And then I started DMing, so being the Dungeon Master, actually this year. That's a relatively new development. I started doing that, funny enough, back in June, so when I had officially been playing D&D for 2 years, I decided it was time to spread my wings a little bit and learn how to be a DM. I first got introduced to D&D by another moderator on a server that I used to be a mod for. And him and I were just talking and just trying to get to know each other a bit because we were going to be on the same team. Moderators stick together, work together, so we decided that, we should spend time together. And he was talking about D&D, told him I never really had played, and he's like, oh, a buddy of mine is the DM, so I can see if he can get you involved in the game. And at first, I was a bit hesitant, and I was like, hey, I'll watch, okay? Like, next time you guys have session, I would be happy to sit in and just kind of observe, watch, figure out if it's something that I want to do. Well, that's not exactly how it happened. I got to the first session, like, alright, let's think of your character, and I was like, oh, what? So, just kind of thrown into the deep end there, and it kind of worked out, but I don't know, it worked out for the best at some point. My first DM was very nice and kind of was like holding my hand a little bit through things as I was learning the ropes, because D&D is something that kind of takes a little bit of practice with. It takes a little bit of practice figuring out how to think as a character, because you and your character, you can think of as being completely different. I mean, sometimes your character ends up being similar to you, like one of my first D&D characters kind of turned out to be a version of me. And I realized that I was role-playing as her. I was like, oh my god, she's just me as a character, and that's okay. Sometimes it takes a bit to be able to distance yourself from you and your character. Like, I think one of the best examples I can think of was in one of my sessions, actually, where I was playing that certain character. I had a friend of mine in the party who was like, now, my character thinks that this is a wonderful idea. I think this is a bad idea. So it's very important to be able to have that separation, because you want to be able to act as your character is going to. For example, if the Dungeon Master is like, oh, you walk into this dimly lit room and you can't really see where you're going, but there is a suspicious lever on the wall. Now, a character who's going to be curious and inquisitive is going to be like, ooh, lever. I want to touch it, and I want to pull it. You as a player is thinking, oh no, that's obviously a trap. It's probably going to be something I don't want to deal with. It's going to probably hurt. But you have to be able to distance yourself from that, because that's just kind of how you roleplay. So after making my character, I decided to stick with it, and we met every other Sunday, and we just had a grand old time. It took me a little bit to get into the groove of how to play, like I mentioned before. Like, I didn't really, as a character, interact with many things. I just kind of, like, sat in the back seat and, like, watched everybody else who knew what they were doing kind of do their thing, and it kind of sucked, but it also gave me the experience to, like, learn and grow as a player. Like, looking back at my first character and looking at my most recent character, it's such a huge, stark difference. Like, I never really developed my character super well the first time around, but now I have a character who's actually pretty in-depth, and he's got, obviously, character to him. So maybe later I'll go on and talk about some of the characters that I have made throughout my time as a D&D player. I do have a couple, I think about like 5 that I've made, and there's one that I've been thinking about making but I don't really have a use for him as a character since I don't want to get involved with any more games. I play in 2, I DM for 1, and I co-DM for another. So as you can see, that's actually a lot of work. Being a DM is a lot of work, and I'll get into that a bit later. But I just didn't really want to get into another game, but there was a character that I thought about. I was like, it doesn't hurt to make it up, because even if I make it up and don't use him, I can put him into one of my campaigns if I really want to. And honestly, that's probably one of the most convenient things about being a DM and a player, is that you get to insert your previous characters into the campaigns that you DM for. I can't tell you how excited I was to be able to put some of my pre-existing characters in the campaign that I'm DMing for, because it was really cool to be able to see how my players interacted with some of my characters that I've already made. And I kind of got a little bit excited and was just like, man, they're not going to ask what her name was, they're not going to get to know her. I was pretty excited because I know how much of a great character she is, but they don't. So it was really cool being able to see how my character interacted with them, because it's just a different experience from the campaign that she was in. Before I do go on and talk about the different types, quote unquote, of D&D, I guess I will say what my favorite things about D&D are. And I think one of my favorite things about D&D is the memories that you make with the other players. There are a lot of interactions that can happen, not only between people outside of character, but also in character. There are a lot of different memories that I have from my very first game that I still kind of treasure and hold dear to me, because not only was it my first campaign, but there were a lot of good and happy, fun memories. So I think that's one of my favorite things, is just the friendships that you forge with the other, human players. But also one of the things that I like is being able to watch your character grow, because throughout the story, your character will overcome obstacles and will suffer through hardships and all that jazz. So being able to see that progression and growth is something that you can be kind of proud in, almost. I mean, it is your character that you've made up, and sometimes you end up getting a bit attached to it. One of my characters that I had made, the DM had told me, don't get too attached to it. I was like, no, it's already too late. I'm already attached to him, I love him, he's amazing, and it is what it is. Another one of the things about D&D that I like is being able to be something else. Something other than run-of-the-mill, ordinary you. You can be a wizard, you can be a thief, you can be this great fighter, all this stuff. So it really gives you the opportunity to think outside of the box, to be something other than yourself, and I think that's a really cool creative avenue to be able to expand into. If you have not yet been able to experience D&D, I hope that this podcast will maybe pique your interest in it, or that you will be able to get into D&D at some point, because I really think it is an awesome, wonderful experience, and that I think everyone should be able to experience once, even if it's a one-shot. Whether it's, you play for a couple of hours and you never play it again, or you go to your first campaign, your first session, you love it, and you go back for more, and you join other campaigns and you meet other people, because it's really such an awesome community where people can really band together and create memories. Okay, before I go on and on about how amazing and wonderful D&D is and how much I love it, I guess I'm going to talk about the different types of D&D like I mentioned earlier. So there's 2 main branches, I guess you could say, of D&D. There's 2 different types, and that would be Pathfinder and regular D&D. And I was going to go into a little bit of detail about D&D and the different editions that they had, but as I was kind of going into the thicket of everything, I was actually researching a bunch of the stuff too, when I was thinking about the section, and things just kind of got, I wouldn't say complicated, but things got kind of long, drawn out, and I just didn't think it was something that would be really necessary to go into detail. I guess the only thing I will say from the different editions is that, obviously they kept adding and changing. So from the very first edition of D&D, you had 4 classes and that was it. And then they progressed forward from that and added so many more. And it was during this progression forward that rules started to change a little bit, as well as things started getting played and tested. People were saying, this doesn't quite work, this could be better, this could be tweaked more, this could be clarified more. So it was during this period of time that Pathfinder became a thing. So D&D has been around since like 1974. And yes, you heard me right. 1974. D&D has been around for a while. So it was during all this going forward and trouble, like trial and error period of time, that people were seeing what they were doing and saying, yeah, I don't know about that one, Chief. So in August of 2007, Wizards of the Coast, who, owned D&D Dungeons & Dragons at the time, announced that they were releasing the 4th edition, and that was going to replace 3.5. So just to backstep a bit, the reason why it's 3.5 is because they really didn't add a lot of mechanical changes. I think they added a bunch of more like items, monsters, and they didn't really feel like it needed its own edition number, so they just changed it to 3.5, so from 3 to 3.5. And many of the staff were concerned about like it being a little bit more restrictive. So when they figured, hey, we don't really like where this is going, let's just make our own thing. So they decided to make Pathfinder as a modified version of 3.5. So this is where you see that split between the role-playing community, where you have D&D and you've got Pathfinder. Now, people will say, oh, well, Pathfinder is better for these reasons, and D&D is better for these reasons. But no matter, where the dice fall, at the end of the day, it doesn't change the fact that both Pathfinder and D&D are both fantasy RPGs that are tabletops that are meant to bring people together. So Pathfinder was initially announced in March of 2008. And so it was designed over the course of a year, and it had kind of a trial and error period where people were able to like post their feedback and play through things and say, oh, this is good how it is, this needs to be changed, add this, etc. And then it wasn't until 10 years after, so in May of 2018, where they decided that they were going to be working on a 2nd edition, so that would be able to refine elements of the rule set and all the feedback that they got from prior years, and they released that. Funny enough, I didn't know this, they released the 2nd edition of Pathfinder August of 2019, so of this year. I was like, wow, I didn't actually know that, since I really don't play Pathfinder. I played Pathfinder at my first campaign, but other than that, I moved away from Pathfinder to 5e because I was just able to find more dungeon masters who were familiar and comfortable with DMing 5e. So it was in that 1 year, again, where they were able to play test and get feedback and then be able to make modifications based on the feedback they received from players. Alright, so some of you might be thinking, okay, wait a minute, why do there have to be this split? What's the big deal? So if there was this split, what's the difference between 5e and Pathfinder? And so I did some more research and looking into it because I figured I don't really know since I really only have played 5e. So I found an article that was talking about how D&D 5e focuses on more like ease of use, while Pathfinder has more mechanical complexity. So if you really want to get bogged down with mechanics, then you want to go Pathfinder. If you just want to focus on the role-playing experience and being able to go through the story, then definitely you want to go 5e. For right now, I'm going to speak as a DM and as a player and say, this is kind of why, in this aspect, I prefer 5e. I personally don't like getting too bogged down into the mechanical complexity. For example, there is something that is a mechanic in the game called carrying capacity. So you can have weight. All the items and equipment that you carry all attribute to some weight factor. And if you have too much you're carrying, it will impact how you do things. So it'll impact your running, walking speed, how well you can dodge things, etc. And for me, I don't want to have to worry about that. I mean, if people go too crazy, like as a DM, if you've got a character who has like 5 swords and like 3 shields and has like 20 potions on them, like, yeah, I'm gonna be like, alright, bud, like, ease up a little bit, like, cut back, get rid of some stuff. But other than that, I don't want to have to worry about something like this. I'm going to want my players to have fun. I'm going to want to more focus on the actual role-playing experience and telling the story other than getting too nitty-gritty about some of the details. And so another thing that separates D&D from Pathfinder is, again, that easy to do versus the more complex. And that also goes with character creation. And honestly, at first, I really wasn't quite sure what they were talking about, because when I remembered making my character for Pathfinder, it wasn't that much different from making it for 5e. So I actually pulled up my old character sheet from the Pathfinder adventure that I did, and I also pulled up one of my characters that I have for 5e, and I wasn't really noticing too much of a difference until I got to the skills. When you get to the skills for Pathfinder, they're a bit more fleshed out. There's a lot more than it is for 5e. For 5e, you've got some, but for Pathfinder, it's just a lot more. For example, with Pathfinder, you have knowledge, but it's not just knowledge. It's knowledge arcana, dungeoneering, engineering, geography, history, local, nature, nobility, planes, and religion. And some of these don't exist in 5e. Like, you don't really have a knowledge nobility, and you don't have dungeoneering, for example. But with 5e, you still see some of these skills, at least with arcana and history, nature, and religion, but they are split up. They don't fit under a knowledge category like it does in Pathfinder. It's just separate things. And again, like, to me, as a DM, this obviously would not really bother me at all. It would just mean I would have a little bit more freedom to be able to ask players to do some kind of a skill check for me. It wouldn't just be under one category. It would be, oh yeah, you see a painting of some person on the wall, and a player asks, do I know who this is? And I could say, roll skillage, or roll knowledge for nobility, and they can do that. But as a player, like, that doesn't really bother me too much. I don't mind having things a little bit more compact. Like, it to me just doesn't really make too much of a difference, but to some people I can see where it would make all the difference in the world, because some people really like to have that nitty-gritty sense of personalization. So another difference between the two of these sets of rules is that Pathfinder has more material than 5e. Now, again, to me, as a DM, this isn't too big of a deal. Like, when I was first asking a bunch of my DM friends, hey, what do you do for your campaigns? Do you make your own, or do you just get a book and run the campaign from there? And I was kind of surprised to hear all of them made their own. So to not really have a book, to me, doesn't really make that much of a difference. It just means I can make the experience mine. I can make it more memorable. Yeah, it's a little bit more work, a lot of more work, but it's still fun to do. You know, it shows your players how much love you put into the campaign. It shows them how much you care about giving them a good experience. Not saying that people who use the book are lazy, just that people who make their own really want to tailor it to their players and be able to make it something that everybody can really get something out of. Now, what they might be talking about is that there might be more, like, monsters or whatever that you can pick from Pathfinder, but as a DM, again, you kind of use the book as a guideline. Like, I can overrule something if I don't want someone to be able to do it, or if I think something should or can be done, I can absolutely say that, because it's my dungeon, it is my rules, I am your god, thank you very much. So, I don't really see it as too much of an issue. You can just kind of make your own, like, oh, well, this isn't an actual thing, but let me just drop some stats for it. I can make it some attacks. And just kind of like taking things from other monsters that are already things. Like, there's homebrew stuff that you could always borrow from as well. So it's not really too much of a deal, and I don't really think there's, like, too much of a shortage of material. You can kind of always find something to use, or just make something up yourself. So the last thing that was mentioned in this article is how 5e focuses more on telling stories and focusing on roleplay, and Pathfinder is more if you want to have an intricate gaming experience. And I already talked about that a little bit, and it's more if you want to have a nice, again, story experience, then definitely go 5e. If you really want to get more into how to, do things, or being able to do all the gaming mechanics and all that, then go play Pathfinder. Either way, nobody's gonna look down on you for playing either system. I like to have joking arguments with my old DM about how 5e is a lot better than Pathfinder. Like, oh, well, I hate 5e and Pathfinder so much better. It's like, to each their own, right? So, I don't know. No matter which system you pick, you will always be able to find somebody to play with if that's the route that you want to go down. Alright, so before I go into talking a little bit about character creation, I decided it would be a little bit of fun to talk about the different D&D dice, because as everybody knows, or probably people have seen, there are a couple of different die that are used in D&D, but looking at them, it's not exactly obvious what they're used for, and anybody who sees them will probably think, oh wow, you're such a nerd. But of course you're a nerd, you're playing D&D. So we're just gonna jump right into talking about the different die and what they do, what they're used for. So just a warning, I'm kind of bad at pronouncing names and things, so I'm probably going to butcher some of the names of these die, and this was actually a really cool section to do some research on, because even I wasn't really sure about the dice and their names and most what they're common for. Even though I've used them, I didn't really know that there were certain things that these die are meant to do. So I'm going to talk about the lowest number first and then go to the higher number. So the first one that we have on our list is our D4, our tetrahedron. So this is commonly used to determine the damage done by small weapons. And I never really thought about that, but then after I read about that, I was like, oh, I guess that makes sense because I have a dagger, and anytime I use my dagger, which is a small weapon, I use my D4. Now this is kind of like the Lego of D&D dice. Don't step on it. It'll probably hurt. It's in the shape of like a pyramid. It's kind of one of the most awkward die to roll because it's that pyramid shape. So, and you kind of think of it like, how do you roll like a pyramid? But on each point, you will have the 1, 2, 3, and 4. So they both meet at that point. So it's never like, oh, I don't know what side this landed on. I wonder what it is. Like, there's a couple of different numbers. It'll always be the one number on the same side. So you'll know what you rolled. Our next one is our lovely D6. Now, most of you have seen D6s because you find them in most basic board games at home, probably. So this is what they call the cube. So most people have a couple sets of D6 so that you can roll them quickly. So if it says, in the spell or damage roll, it'll say roll 3d6, for example. So instead of just rolling your D6 3 times, people will just get 3 D6s and roll them at the same time. So this is the die that you use when you're making your character, and how that works is you roll 4d6 and you take the 3 highest numbers, and then whatever that equals to is what your ability score is, and then associated with that ability score is a modifier. So if you get, for example, a 12, that'll give you a +1 to your rolls. So if you end up rolling, for example, a 15, then you actually get a 16. And this is also used for larger weapons. So whatever weapon that you've got that's a little bit bigger than smaller weapons, you will use a d6 to roll damage for that. Next we have our d8, the octahedron. This is often used for larger weapons as well. And I often forget about this die. You really don't roll this very often. So there was one time I actually had to roll a d8. I'm like rummaging through all my dice, like, where the heck where's my d8? I know it's in here somewhere, but it's still an important die. Give it some love. Now we have our d10, which I'm probably going to absolutely butcher the name, but here it goes. That is our pentagonal trapezohedron. And there are 2 dice that are actually d10s. The first d10, I'm going to say it's the true d10 because it's numbered 0 through 9. And I know that sounds kind of weird, like how can you get a 0? But 0 is usually counted as our 10. And the reason why it's a 0 and not a 10 is because when you roll it with the other d10, which is a percentile die, the faces on that one go from 00 to 90. So when you're rolling for a percentage, you roll both of them, and whatever that number is on the true d10, that'll be the ending number. So for example, if I roll my percentile die and I get an 80, and then I roll the d10 and I get an 8, that means that the percentage is an 88. The only exception to that is when you roll 00. So when you roll 00, that is actually the 100. And so the d10 is still used for damage output by the biggest weapons that you can have in D&D. Our next die, which is also kind of one of the forgotten ones of D&D, is our D12, our dodecahedron. And it's not super common to use in D&D, like I mentioned, except for some damage rolls you can use a D12. And it can be also used to determine the hour of day or night or the month of the year, but generally you don't really see that. As a DM, I've never done that. I never really thought to consider doing that, but that is something that you can do. But it's also something that you can use for damage rolls, again, for the biggest weapons, much like the D10. And the very last die in our set of 7 is none other than the famous D20. This is the die that usually comes to mind when you think of D&D. You pretty much hear about it all the time, like, oh, roll a D20, or a nat 1, or a nat 20. So that's where you hear those numbers from. It's usually from this die. And this is our icosahedron, the decider of D&D dice. And it's the decider because this is the die you're going to use to determine if whatever you're trying to do is successful. And that's attacks, saving throws, skill checks, and even ability checks. And after you roll a d20 to see if you hit an enemy, you'll roll another die to see how much damage you deal, like I talked about earlier. And I'll say owning D&D dice is absolutely optional unless you decide to do an in-person session. Now, some friends, if they've played before and have a couple of sets, they probably wouldn't mind sharing and letting you borrow one of their sets if you ask nicely, but usually you can get a set pretty cheap. Depends on where you look, but Amazon probably has them for pretty cheap. But even then, like, if you're doing an online session, you definitely do not have to buy your own dice if you don't want to. There are things that you can roll online, or if you're using Roll20, for example, which is how I play all of my campaigns, there's a way to just in the chat roll for whatever die you want to roll for. I'll tell you right now, though, I really like having D&D dice. Like, I have about 30 sets, and I know, that sounds outlandish, and it is, but let that sink in. I have 30 sets of D&D dice, and I plan on getting more, to be honest. There's always sets that I think look really cool, and at some point I do want to make a bit of a decorative piece for it, so that's also kind of my excuse, and a lot of the sets aren't super expensive, but there are some sets out there that are really expensive because they're either like made out of precious stone or gemstones, or they're metal or wooden or something, and they cost quite a bit of money depending on where you look. I mean, my excuse for having a bunch of dice is the fact that I'm a DM, but that's not entirely true. But my friends always joke with me, like, so how many dice do you need? Like, are you ever going to stop by? And it's like, yeah, probably not. Though what is common for people to do is that when they have a character, they will have a dice set that they use for that character that represents them, and I kind of have done this before. But then as I got so many more dice and I started accumulating them, I was like, okay, well, maybe I really should start using some of these sets that I have that I haven't really been using. So I started rotating them out to whatever I felt like rolling with that day. Alrighty, now we're going to jump into probably what I consider to be the meat of the podcast. The main topic that we're going to be talking about today is going to be character creation. And I don't really know how long or short this section is going to be, but it probably can get pretty long, because creating a character can actually be pretty extensive and there's a lot to talk about with it. So I'll try not to get too super into detail about it, and if we still have time afterwards, then I might talk about some of the characters that I've made. So in terms of character creation, I'm just going to stick with the basic things, so everything that's outlined in the player's handbook. There is homebrew stuff, there is stuff from other campaigns that people can take from in terms of classes and races, but I'm just going to try and keep things a bit basic because there is, like I said, a lot to talk about, and I don't want to get too far out into it. When I started DMing, I tried to have everyone stay with the player's handbook just because they were all still new as well, and I wanted to keep them having a bit of a larger scope, but not too large that they were getting lost in, oh, I don't know what class or race to do. So I figured there's enough classes in the player's handbook that it was probably a good start for all of them. Though, what a DM decides to do is totally up to them. If there is something homebrew or from another campaign, you can totally ask your DM, like, hey, I really want to do this, is this okay? And they will either okay it or not, totally up to them. But most DMs will pretty much be open to doing anything because they want their players to make the best out of the campaign. So I've usually found that when I'm making a character, I like to pick my class and my race first. It's just kind of like to help me figure out where I'm going to want to go in terms of like ability scores. So after I take my class and my race, decide I want to do this, and then I roll for my ability scores, then I kind of have a better idea of where I want to put them, because when you have a bunch of ability scores in front of you, it's just a bunch of numbers. You don't really know what to do with it, but once you've kind of got like a class and a race, it comes a little bit easier to where you want to put everything. So I'm just going to list off all the different classes that are in the player's handbook, and I'm just going to do them in alphabetical order because D&D Beyond puts them in alphabetical order. And it's actually, if you don't know about D&D Beyond, it is a really good resource to use that really helps you figuring everything out, and it has a lot of the information in one place. However, with the convenience of everything being in one place, unfortunately D&D Beyond does charge for a lot of the material that it has on its site, some of the extra books, but also some of the stuff in Player's Handbook, which is kind of upsetting, but at least it's a good groundwork if you are looking for some of the material. And you can just do a Google search and you can find the material as well. Roll20 has actually most, if not all, the material for the Player's Handbook on its site. Or you could just buy the books. I actually have some of the books physically because it just, to me, was a lot easier than just looking it up in a PDF. So, for all the different classes in the Player's Handbook, there is Barbarian, Bard, Cleric, Druid, Fighter, Monk, Paladin, Ranger, Rogue, Sorcerer, Warlock, and Wizard. So I'm not going to go into detail about what each class is and what each does, but I will say some of them are focused on fighting, so like the Barbarian and the Fighter, and some are focused more on magic, like the Sorcerer and the Wizard. And then there are other that are focused a little bit on utility, so Druid can have a bit of utility, and so can the Rogue, for example. So without getting too stuck into details here, each class has its own set of features that makes it unique from the other classes. And so we're just gonna pick Druid here, for example, because Druid was the first class that I ever got to experience in D&D, so we're gonna talk about that. So each class has its own hit die that you get, and for a Druid, that is a 1d8. So this will determine how much HP you get, and it'll also determine how much you can heal during a short rest. So if you've taken damage, for example, and you have a short rest, you can roll a 1d8, and whatever number you roll is how much you will restore your health. And this will increase as you level up, for example, but at the start it's just 1d8. And so how you determine your starting HP, you get the highest number of that. So for the 1d8, you get an 8 plus your Constitution modifier. So whatever ability score you put for that will have a modifier. Whatever that modifier is, you will add that to that number, and so on and so forth. Like, if you have a class that has a 1d12, you'll take that 12 and then add your con modifier to that as well. And when you get to higher levels, there's actually two ways that you can increase your HP. You can either roll a 1d8, and whatever that number is, and then you add your Constitution modifier to that. So you could roll anywhere between a 1 or an 8 for your 1d8 for when you're going to level 2, for example, and then add your Constitution modifier. And that means you could either roll really well or really low, but there's also a safer bet if you would like. And for Druids, that safer bet is 5. So usually that number will tend to be in the middle, and you can take that number and also add your Constitution modifier to it as well. Usually, I see people taking the safer bet. Some people really don't like to gamble, especially with HP, so they'll take the safer route and they'll take the middle ground and add their Constitution modifier to that. And usually that's a really good way to go because, you know, usually if your Constitution modifier, for example, is +2 and you got 5, you've already got 7, so that's not bad. That's not really bad at all. I mean, you'd really only be missing out on like a little bit more, so it's easier to go the safer route because what if you roll a 1? Then you're going to be really hurt for HP. So then you also have a set of proficiencies that each class is proficient with, and that also includes armor, weapons, tools, your saving throws, and your skills. So for Druid, for example, the armor that you're proficient in is light armor, medium armor, and shields. So Druids actually can't wear armor or use shields that are made out of metal. That's just like kind of their thing. And you'll see that a lot actually. There's another class, monks, who actually get a bonus for not wearing any armor, so that's pretty cool. And that'll affect what is called your AC. And that is your ability to not get hit. That is your armor class. So, for example, if you're in combat with something and your AC is 15, they have to roll a 15 or higher to be able to hit you. And the advantage will always go to the attacker. So if they roll a 15 and your armor class is a 15, they will still hit you, unfortunately. But that is how it goes. As for weapon proficiency with druids, you've got clubs, daggers, darts, javelins, maces, quarterstaffs, scimitars, sickles, slings, and spears. And each obviously has their own benefits to using it, but some classes will be proficient in other things as well, just like armor. It just depends on the class that you're using. And you've also got whatever tools you're proficient with, but also that doesn't really matter terribly much. But for druids, it is the herbalism kit, in case you were wondering. So for your saving throws, for druids, you have intelligence and wisdom. And these aren't super important. I mean, saving throws are important, but in terms of what you're proficient in, it doesn't really quite matter. It just depends on what class you are. We'll mix them around. There aren't too many saving throws that are in the list. In total, you will have 6 different saving throws. There's strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, and charisma. So, for example, if you are fighting a enemy and they cast a spell, in the spell description it will say the enemy who is affected by the spell must make an intelligence saving throw, for example, and it'll say what number that they have to beat in order to be successful, and then you will roll for that. So if you're proficient in it, that just means you get a bonus, and it'll just be plus whatever your proficiency bonus is, and that'll change as you level up. I think when you get to level 5 is when you will get a +3 instead of a +2. So each class will have 2 different saving throws that they are proficient with, and those are also affected by your ability score modifiers, because unsurprisingly, when you look to the side and you have all of your different skills, there's strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, and charisma. So those modifiers will match up with your saving throws, and that modifier will be added or subtracted to it, and then you will add your proficiency bonus if you are proficient in said saving throw. And now for the skills. This is the part where you really get to customize your character a little bit more in terms of proficiencies. For example, with Druid, you get to pick 2 from the following: from Arcana, animal handling, insight, medicine, nature, perception, religion, and survival. So you can pick whichever 2 of those that you want, and then you can say you're proficient in them. So I'm just going to list off all the different skills that you can have access to in D&D, and you've got your acrobatics, which is influenced by Dex modifier, your animal handling, which is wisdom, arcana, which is intelligence, athletics, which is strength, deception, which is charisma, history, which is intelligence, insight, which is wisdom, intimidation, which is charisma, investigation, that's intelligence, medicine, which is wisdom, nature, that's intelligence, perception, that's wisdom, performance, which is charisma, persuasion, which is charisma, religion, which is intelligence, sleight of hand, which is dex, stealth, which is dex, and survival, which is wisdom. And so like I mentioned, this is where you can kind of start customizing your character a little bit. For example, if you don't really know what to do for your druid and you decide you want the backstory of your druid that they worked on a farm or something, then you might want to pick animal handling because your druid would have experience with animal handling. It would make sense. You don't have to do that. It doesn't really quite matter, but if you wanted to kind of like tie things together, you could absolutely do that. But if you just want to pick whatever you think is going to be most useful, like you're looking at this list and be like, man, I don't know when any of this is going to be any kind of useful, but Arcana might be useful if I want to find any magic stuff that's going on, or medicine, because I think that might be useful to the party. You could absolutely do that too. It's really all a matter of preference. And there's a bunch of additional stuff here, like there's spell casting and all the different things that are specific to Druid, for example, but I'm not going to go into that because I don't want to get too deep into all of this. I just kind of wanted to give like a big overview about character creation, so we're just going to end it there in terms of talking about characters. But if you are interested in learning more about it, you could definitely search it up on Google and either go like to D&D Beyond and you could read the entire page on any class and kind of get to know them a bit better and what's so special about them. Alrighty, so continuing on, we're going to talk about all the different races, and again, I'm just going to stick with the player's handbook, and we've got Dragonborn, dwarf, elf, gnome, half-elf, halfling, half-orc, human, and tiefling. When I was trying to determine what race I wanted to talk about, I was going to stick with the theme and go with my first D&D character for 5e, and she was a human druid, but humans are actually pretty boring. Their racial trait gives them a +1 to all abilities and an extra language because they had to do something to entice people to pick it because of how bland and boring it is, but, I mean, come on. This is an RPG fantasy, for crying out loud. Like, pick something that's out of the ordinary. We're humans. We get to be humans all the time. Pick something badass or cool and just be able to roll with that. So, instead of talking about human, we're going to talk about my most recent character's race, which is Dragonborn. So much like how classes have that common core that they all have and then they just branch off from there, it's the same thing with races. So, for example, all races talk about ability score increase. So for Dragonborn, your strength score increases by 2 and your charisma score increases by 1. So automatically you can just add those two to their respective stats, and wherever you decide to put your stats in is where you put your stats in. And I'll talk about ability scores a bit later. Next we have age, which varies between the different races, and it really doesn't so much matter. It just helps you build character, and it like kind of tells you like when they reach adulthood, etc. And again, that's more to like help you. It doesn't really matter too much in the grand scheme of actual playing, but it can help you roleplay a bit better if you see fit. They also talk about alignment, which again isn't really super necessary. I guess for some classes it might be, but usually people don't really stick to an alignment. Some do. Some will really hardcore stick to it. They'll be like, nope, this is my alignment and this is how I'm going to be playing. But most players just kind of like, this is a general idea of my character and this is how he's going to act to things. This is how he's going to respond to things. He's a good guy, for example. So if he sees somebody being mugged, he's going to jump in and help, for example. So alignment doesn't mean terribly much. Same thing with size, though. That kind of matters a bit. Not super a lot. But it does help you determine, like, how much you can carry and all that stuff. Like, there's different classes of size. Like, there's small, medium, and large. So for Dragonborn, for example, they are a medium size. And also, you've got your speed. Usually, your walking speed is going to be 30, but it depends. If you're smaller, you're probably going to have a shorter walking speed. Or if you're something a lot larger, you're going to have something that's a lot bigger. But it also depends on, again, which race you pick. And like I said, there's a couple of things here that are special to just being Dragonborn, so I'm gonna scroll over that. But also, each race kind of has a language that you get to have as well. Each race will speak common, and as the name suggests, that is the common language that is spoken. That is the uniform language that unites everyone together. But for Dragonborn, they know something called Draconic. So each class will kind of have their own different languages that they know, and it's not essential, but it definitely can help determine different interactions between either characters or different party members. For example, in one campaign that I am in, there is a tiefling that knows Infernal, and I actually had a couple of different languages that I could pick from because I got 2 for my race, but then I also had one for something else. And I just decided to pick Infernal, and I made up a reason why my character would know Infernal, and so it helps to have a little bit of some spice. Like, if the two of us ever wanted to have, like, a private conversation, the two of us could just speak in Infernal, and the other characters would be like, I don't know what the heck they're talking about, or enemies, even for that matter, would have no idea what we're saying unless they spoke Infernal. So your race and your class will really help you get a lot of information about your character and what they're going to be good or skilled at. But another way to get additional information about your character is through the background. And I was actually going to talk about my rogue's background, which is Charlatan, but when I was expanding the information on it on D&D Beyond, you had to pay for it, and I didn't want to pay for it, and I don't really feel like Googling it. And upon inspection, I actually found the background of my Dragonborn. So we're going to talk about the noble background. And as you might expect, a lot of this is just flavor text, but there is some information, some useful information that you will gain from your background, and that is your skill proficiencies. And for noble, that is history and persuasion. And you can either pick whatever background you want because you feel like that is what your character would be, or if you just like a certain skill proficiency and you want to have it, you can definitely choose whatever background because that's what you want to do. As long as you can work it into the background of your character, that's really all that matters. You also get a tool proficiency, which in this case for Noble is one type of gaming set, and you also get another choice of a language, so that's pretty darn cool. And it also gives you an additional thing for equipment. So in this case, you get a set of fine clothes, you get a signet ring, you get a scroll of pedigree, and you get a purse containing 25 GP. So each background will determine how much money you get at the beginning unless you choose not to take the starting equipment. If you decide to forgo the starting equipment, then it is because of your class that you will figure out how much you roll, like which dice you roll, to be able to determine how much money you get to keep, and then you get to use that money to buy your equipment. Each background comes with its own unique feature, and in Noble's case, you get something called Position of Privilege. And so thanks to your noble birth, people are inclined to think the better of you, and you're welcome in high society. People assume you have the right to be wherever you are. The common folk make every effort to accommodate you and avoid your displeasure. And other people of high birth treat you as a member of the same social sphere. And you can basically secure an audience with a local noble if you need to. So sometimes that can come in pretty good use, but it's all going to be dependent. Like, you're never going to have something that's going to be super useful all the time. It's always going to be something that's very situational. All right, so now we're going to segue into talking more about the sheet itself. And so when you're presented with a sheet at first, you see character name, and you can just make that whatever you want to be. And then you've got class and level, you've got background, player name, race, alignment, and experience points. And I've already talked about class and level, self-explanatory. Whatever level you are, you just kind of put it on there. Talked about background as well and race. And like I said before, alignment isn't super useful, but if you want to just add it on, you can. And experience points, it depends on the DM. Some DMs, like me, prefer to do milestones, so as you progress through the story and you do things, you just level up. But there is experience points as well, so that's by defeating different enemies, you can gain a certain amount of experience points. And you can do that, but for me, I just never really wanted to deal with remembering, oh, well, this enemy is worth 100 XP, this one's worth 50. I just didn't want to deal with that, and figured it'd just be easier to do milestones, because that's less that, me and my players have to keep track of. But there are DMs who do experience points. There's nothing wrong with doing either. It's all just personal preference. Alrighty, now we're going to talk about the ability scores, which is what I've talked about before, but now we're finally going to dive in and see what's up. So there's strength, there's dexterity, there's constitution, intelligence, wisdom, and charisma. And these will affect your saving throws and will also affect your skills. And there's two different ways you can determine your ability scores. One way is by a system called point buy. And so basically how point buy works is that you start off at a base of 8 and you have a certain amount of points that you can use. And each time you want to increase an ability score by 1, you have to use X number of points. Now, I don't really care for the system too much. I can see why people like it because it's a safe way to avoid getting negative modifiers, because if you want to up, all of your stats to at least 10, so your modifier is +0, that's something you can do. But for me, I like rolling. It's a lot more random, and you can actually get better stats. For example, the highest that you can roll is an 18. So how you roll for stats is you take a 4d6, and you keep the highest 3. And whatever that is will equal whatever, and that number will equal to an ability score modifier. So the funny part, when I was rolling for stats for my Dragonborn fighter, who I was mentioning earlier, well, I didn't mention he was a fighter, but I mentioned a Dragonborn. His name is Azurath. And when I was rolling my ability scores, for fighters, you want to have a high strength modifier. And I actually rolled 6, 6, 6, and whatever the other number was, I don't quite remember what it was, but I rolled an 18. Because he's a Dragonborn, he automatically gets a +2 to strength. So right off the bat, I already had the highest ability score that you can have, which is 20, and that is a +5 modifier. And honestly, that's pretty darn good for being level 1. Having a +5 modifier is not a joke. So for example, I talked about crit failing earlier, and a crit failure is when you roll a nat 1. And a natural 1, it doesn't matter what your ability modifier is on it. A 1 is a 1, and that is a failure. For Azurath, for his, I think it was strength saving throw, it was like an 8. So an 8 was a crit failure. And to me, I don't know, I just always found that funny. And he can hit pretty darn hard, so it's always kind of funny. Everyone's always like, whoa, geez, calm down, Azurath, because, you know, he usually rolls pretty high because he's got a +7, especially since he's proficient in it too, so that's where you get the 7 is 5 + 2. So that's honestly no joke. Now, I get why people would be a little bit nervous with rolling, because there is, again, like I said, that potential to roll negative modifiers, but usually each character class has a bit of a dump stat, so a stat that usually you're not really going to use, and that's not super relevant to the character, so it's kind of just something you can throw in there. But in a lot of cases, it's usually not too bad, and if you end up rolling really bad, like, I'm pretty sure the rule is, well, every DM does it differently, but the ruling that I like to use is that out of all your modifiers, if it equals -1, or your highest stat that you rolled was a 13, then you get to reroll your stats. And DMs are going to be either lenient or strict on that. Some are going to be like, yeah, I don't care, I just want my players to have fun, or whatever, but they still going to want to keep that, like, randomness of, like, oh, well, you know, having a minus modifier in that isn't necessarily bad, and it can still, like, add to character. Like, for example, the lowest stat that I had rolled was a 7, so I got a -2 modifier, and I wasn't too worried about it. I was like, yeah, I'm just going to put it, like, intelligence, because that's not really necessary for a fighter, because I'm not really going to be casting spells or anything. I'm going to be trying to hit things with, like, weapons and everything, so I was able to tie into his backstory how, like, that makes a little bit of sense. Like, for example, with intelligence, that's your modifier for nature, and if you're a noble who really is going to spend most of his time in a castle or something like that, it's going to make sense that you really don't know much about the outside world or about nature. So I was able to kind of tie things together, so it was really cool. So you can always do stuff like that and help build your character even more. Before continuing on, I want to clear up a common misconception about having a negative modifier for intelligence, because a lot of people think that just because you have a negative modifier in intelligence that your character is automatically dumb. Now, are you listening? Are you listening really carefully? Good. Because listen up. If you're not. Just because you have a negative modifier for your intelligence stats does not make your character dumb. It doesn't. Not at all. Does not mean your character is dumb. You can play your character a bit differently, but just because it has the negative modifier does not mean it's dumb. And I feel like a lot of players are too afraid to put the negative modifier in intelligence because they're like, oh man, if I put this in intelligence, it means my character is dumb. No. It does not. If you want to put it in there, go for it. But that does not mean your character is dumb. Now, a lot of the stuff on this sheet is pretty self-explanatory. Like, on the side, you got personality traits, ideals, bonds, and flaws. And again, those really aren't super important. It's just more to help you kind of figure out what you want to do as a character. You've got your attacks and spellcasting, which is like the things that you can do to either hit things or use utility or whatever. You've got your equipment that tells you what you've got and what you've got access to, and also your money. That's pretty important. You also have something like a passive perception, and basically what that is, it's just your ability to notice things just passively, so you don't need to roll for it. It's more of the DM like, oh, I'm gonna try and throw stuff at them, and if their passive perception is high enough, they'll notice it, and if not, they don't. There's also the features and traits. And again, those just kind of are either based on your class or your race. And of course, you got your armor class, which I talked about earlier, which is a combination of your dexterity and your armor in most cases. And you got your speed as well, which determines how fast you can walk or move in a single action. Now, there's this thing at the top, it's inspiration. That's not something that's terribly useful, but it's more of like if you do something really well in the DM's like, wow, you did a really good thing there, or I really liked how you did that, here's an inspiration point. It doesn't really matter too much, but there are times it can come in handy. There's also the proficiency bonus, like I talked about earlier. It starts off as being 2, but when you get to 5th level, it increases to +3, and then all of your skills and all that jazz will increase if you are proficient in them. The rest of the stuff that I'm going to talk about in terms of character sheet is, again, more just flavor. There's the age, size, height, weight, eyes, skin, and hair, which doesn't really mean terribly much. There's also the allies and organizations. There's character appearance. Now, it's totally okay to just go on Google and look up some picture, and even if it's not close enough, it's whatever. You really don't need to have like an actual appearance. As long as you have a description of it, you don't actually need to have a physical representation of it. On Roll20, there is a token that you can use, and even if it looks nothing like your actual character, totally fine. When I was doing my session with my rogue, I had no idea what to use for the token, and my DM just got a picture of Garfield and put it on there. So, I mean, it really doesn't all matter too much. There's also additional features and traits. There's treasure, and it's okay if like most of the stuff is blank. Like looking at my sheet now for Azurath, there's really not much on here except for the background. That's pretty fleshed out because I had a lot of fun writing his background, and that's, again, not super important. It's just flavor and what you want to do. The last page and final thing I'm going to talk about on the sheet is spells. And I'm not going to go too much into it, but there's cantrips, and those are basically like things you can use as many times as you want. And then there's level 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 spells. And depending on how many you can use and have is determined by your level. And I'm not going to go too much more into detail other than that because spells can get pretty complicated. And I made the mistake of using a druid the first time, and I was like, man, this is complicated. I got all these spells, and as a new player, it was pretty overwhelming. I was like, oh god, I gotta like remember all this jazz, and it was just a lot. So much so that the next time I made a character, I'm like, no spellcasting. None. I don't want to deal with it. So, and each character has a spellcasting ability and has a spell save DC and a spell attack bonus, but a lot of characters that really won't be super necessary to because they don't cast spells. The biggest take-home message that I want people to get about character creation is that make it whatever you want. Most DMs, like I said, are very, very lenient about characters and letting the player do whatever they want because they want them to enjoy what they're doing. They want them to be able to do what it is that they set their hearts to. As for me, I'm very much like that. I have a lot of my players who are basically doing whatever they want to be doing. They're like, hey, can I do this? Is this all right with you? And most of the time I say, yeah, sure. Because, again, the guidebook is a guidebook. It is meant to kind of be interpreted a little loosely in some cases. Like, if there is something that I feel like my players should be able to do, then I'm going to let them do it, and that comes with character creation as well. There was one time a player of mine was like, I really want this one skill, but I don't really want this background, and I told them, I was like, if you really want this background with this skill proficiency, just make a good reason as to why you feel that. Even if it's not there, I will still, like, bend the rules a little bit, like, alright, you want this? Then sure, just give me a good reason why. That's all I want. Tell me why. Justification is super important when it comes to D&D. Because, again, DMs will pretty much let you do anything, but you have to have a good reason for it, and you have to be able to explain why you're doing something. And if you're able to do so in a good way, then the DM will pretty much allow you to do it. But if you can't really come and think about it, and don't really know what you want to do with it, the DM is probably like, yeah, no, I don't really want you doing that. Since I have talked a lot about character creation, I felt it appropriate to be able to talk about my characters that I've created throughout the years, because you can see how some of the things apply to some of the characters that I have made, and I'm not going to go into too much detail about my Pathfinder character. I'll probably just introduce her and talk a bit about her a little bit, but then I can go into a little bit more depth on my other characters since those are D&D 5e, which is what I focus on more in this podcast. First up, my first ever D&D character is Indriri. Now, she is a wyvern druid and has an animal companion named Krasakata. He is a gigantic scorpion, and I actually got the name from a actual scorpion that exists. Like, if you look up Krasakata, you will find whatever scorpion it's named after. Off the top of my head, I can't remember what it was. So wyverns can actually fly, but the DM who I was playing with didn't want characters to be able to fly, but he wanted me to be able to pick the class that I wanted to, so he said, okay, you can be a wyvern, but no flying. So basically, how I was able to compensate for that was I just had in her background that she was a traveler with an adventurers guild, and they were exploring through this chasm, and all of a sudden, all these boulders came out of nowhere, and she tried to save her companions, but in doing so, she ended up getting crushed by the boulders and injuring her wings permanently, so she can no longer use them to fly. And that was pretty much the most that I got out of her background, but at the same time, when I was still learning how to play D&D and how to make a character, I really didn't know too much. I was very inexperienced, so I wasn't really able to flesh out the background as much as I have been able to for my two most recent characters, who I will talk about in a little bit. And again, like I said, I'm not going to go too much into detail with her. This is probably about where I'm going to end it, because I don't really want to go into all the abilities and all that jazz and all the spells, because a lot of the stuff that is relevant in Pathfinder is not relevant in 5e. After having some experience with D&D, I decided to go into 5e with another campaign that was run by my friend, and I decided to stick with the same class that I had already had because I was already a little bit familiar with it, so I thought it would be like an easy way to ease into a new set of rules, and that is where Soraka came from, or as I actually almost said Sriracha, because that's what everybody in the campaign called her. And she's pretty decent. I'm looking at her stats right now, and her wisdom is the highest as you'd expect from a druid. It's 18, so +4 modifier. And then you've got the constitution at 15 and intelligence at 15. So having constitution can be pretty high, and it's a good thing to do so because then it helps influence your HP, which I probably talked about earlier. And for her strength and her charisma, they're both 9, so -1. And the reason why that is the way it is because as a druid, you don't really use strength terribly much. You're going to be more focused on casting spells, which is why you wanted the wisdom modifier to be the highest. And much like in Dreary, she doesn't really have too much of a background other than the fact that she was the adventuring type and she loved going off into the wilderness. And then one day she was wandering around and she met an older druid named Ardon. And so she decided that she wanted to learn the ways of how to be a druid under him. So he kind of took her under his wing and taught her how to be a druid. And after many years of practice, she decided that she wanted to go out and see the world more, aka meet up with the party that she was traveling with. And she eventually joined up with them in the hopes of being able to learn more about magic and about nature. Now, you don't really have to have like a character who's kind of like that, who's like, oh, I want to go learn more about X specific thing. It's just something I decided to throw in because I, again, was kind of inexperienced about how to make characters, and I just thought up of something, really didn't know what else to say, so I was like, yeah, I'll just throw it in there and see what that's all about. And I do want to reiterate that it's okay sometimes if you like tweak your character as you're playing them, like if you have ideas of what you want your character to be but then you end up playing them differently, it's totally okay to go back and change things. Like for example, I kept finding myself like anytime there was some kind of like animal or nature encounter that I was always like, wait, nope, let me do it, I'm the druid, come on, let me do this. So I decided to like kind of add that in as her personality, that if there's something like nature related, she's gonna be first in to be like, nah, let me handle this. The next two characters I'm going to talk about, I will really go into a little bit more depth about them because they're the most fleshed out and kind of when I started feeling like I had a handle on how to play D&D. This next character is none other than my catfolk rogue, Miyumi, or as everyone likes to call her, Mimi. So her background is charlatan, so kind of have a bit of that rogue vibe to it. Obviously she's a rogue, so kind of wanted to have some skills that would go along with it. The alignment, I'm pretty sure I picked because of the rogue part and not because of the race part. Sometimes races tend to be certain alignments as well as, classes being certain alignments, which I talked about earlier. So you just kind of pick one, like I said, not super important or necessary, but I decided to just throw something there just to kind of have it there. And it's funny because looking back at my sheet versus Soraka, I don't really have too much in the ways of like flaws, bonds, ideals, or personality traits. For her, I had like a bit more like fleshed out stuff, but for her it's more like bullet points. Like personality traits for Miyumi are like reserved, confident, keeps her cool, and skeptical. She, as a background, I don't want to get too super long into it, but she doesn't have parents. Wow, imagine that. A rogue that doesn't have parents. Very original. But her parents were killed off when she was very young. Her father was a trader and her mother was an instructor in martial arts and combat. So ever since, her parents' death, she's been pretty reserved and skeptical of the people around her, but she's pretty confident. She's confident in her ability to be a rogue and to be in combat. And to kind of play off the bit of being skeptical and reserved, I had the flaw of her, being too reliant on herself. And I haven't really gotten to use that too much to my advantage in D&D, but that's not terribly important, like I said. And she doesn't really have any bonds. And again, not really super important, but she definitely has been starting to bond with the party members that she has been traveling with. So, also to kind of go off of what the ability scores are for her charisma is 17, her wisdom is 12, her intelligence is 12, her constitution is 13, dexterity is 16, strength is 10. So rogues rely more on dex and charisma more than anything, so I have those being the highest. And again, like I was saying with constitution, you're going to want that to be a little bit higher because you're going to want to help have a good modifier for having more HP. And then you don't really rely too much on strength as a rogue. A lot of your weapons are actually based off of dexterity, so they're finesse weapons, so you really aren't going to need strength for those. And then she is proficient in deception, insight, perception, persuasion, sleight of hand, and stealth. So kind of stuff that you would expect a rogue to be proficient in. Now, I didn't talk too much about races that weren't in the player's handbook, but I will talk about catfolk since I'm talking about all of my D&D characters, and I'm pretty familiar with catfolk. This race is also known as Tabaxi, and you get a 35 speed instead of a 30, so not like super amazing, but hey, anything I guess is better than 30, because like I might have mentioned earlier, that is the standard. She gets low light vision, so you can see within 60 feet in dim light as if it were bright. And she also gets something called Cat's Claws, so she can climb 20 feet, which is pretty cool. A lot of, I feel, classes and races really don't allow you to have a climbing speed, but this one has, a definite climbing speed. You also have claws as a natural weapon, and you can use them for unarmed strikes, and you can roll a d4 slashing damage for that. There's also cat-like reflexes, which is you add half of your proficiency bonus rounding down to your initiative rolls. That's pretty helpful and cool. You also have feline empathy, so you can communicate simple ideas with feline creatures. Haven't really been able to use that yet, but it's kind of for flavor. You don't really use it much, and it would just be to communicate with something else. And the ability scores of just charisma, is increased by 2. You are also proficient in stealth. So I mentioned earlier, it's called cat-like tread, but that's why she's proficient in stealth. There's also fleet of foot, and so your movement 35, like I said before. And this is the cool part. This is why I think catfolk are pretty cool, and I feel like sometimes can be pretty broken. They have resistance to damage taken from falling. So if I'm like 100 feet up on a building, I can just jump down like it's not a big deal. So, just typical cat things. So I'll tread back a little bit to her background. Like I had mentioned before, her parents had an occupation and they were both killed, and they don't really know why. And so at first, Miyumi tried to take over the business of her father, but she didn't have the same knack and talent that he did, plus she was kind of younger, so a lot of people didn't really take her seriously. So she was living in the gym that her mom would teach from, and after the whole trading thing fell through, she couldn't keep it, and she eventually had to give it up. and she was able to find some place to live in, like in the outskirts of the city, which is where she learned Infernal. If you noticed, I actually talked about that a bit earlier. I talked about Infernal. So this was Mimi. She learned Infernal because her neighbors were tieflings, and tieflings kind of have a bad rap in the D&D world. Like, a lot of civilizations and everything see them as outcasts. So I was like, let's play into that and make it so there's a bunch of tieflings in the outskirts of town, and she just happened to learn Infernal by picking it up from her neighbors. So she already had a bit of groundwork on how to be stealthy and be in combat, but she was able to gain a little bit more experience when she joined up with, I wouldn't say so much a guild, but just another, like, band of thieves. She tried to work alone when necessary and tried not to kill or get into fights if possible. She just tried to, like, sneak out, get in, get out as fast as possible undetected. So she kind of had, like, her own code of ethics. She only stole from those who could afford to lose something. She only stole what she needed, and she didn't want to kill. And I actually even decided to give her a bit of, like, a code name of when she used to work with the Band of Thieves, and her name was the Sapphire Blaze because her eyes are blue, and she'd just be so quick, and it would be dark that all you could see was the glow from her eyes, and then she'd just zoom, she's out. So kind of like similar to how, cats, you've probably seen them if you have a cat or pictures, that glowing they do because of how the light is being absorbed in the eye and how it's being reflected back, all that jazz, eye stuff. That reflection was kind of like what I was, going off of. That all you would see would be like her eyes and then whoosh, gone. Just like a flash. So the Sapphire Blaze. But yeah, sorry for going on and on about Mimi. She's kind of one of my favorites. She's definitely like my baby girl. So yeah, kind of a little bit long-winded there, but I mean, I think it's important to be able to see, like, just how in-depth you can be about character creation. You can be as in-depth or, whatever as you want. You don't have to have a super well fleshed out background, like with Soraka. I barely had anything, but you can still roleplay off that. You can still have a good character. Or you could have something like I have with Miyumi, where it's this, pretty well fleshed out backstory, and you can just get a good feel of the kind of character she is and where she's been from, or where she's gone. Alright, well, I can't talk about my baby girl and not talk about my baby boy. The final character I'm going to talk about is none other than my Dragonborn fighter, Azurath. Now, his background is noble, and I just had the idea of having a character who was royalty that was kind of on a mission to find himself and be able to come back as a better, stronger ruler. So a little bit about Azurath's background is that he is the only son and heir to the throne, and he was basically taught from a young age to, what was expected of him and what he needed to do to be a good ruler. And his father involved him with the dealings of the kingdom to try and groom him so he would, be able to be a strong ruler. And his father also decided that it would be good for him to serve the ranks of the military. So he went off to be a part of the military. He did a decent job, and his parents like, oh wow, he's doing great, like, let's bring him back. It was more just kind of like for a learning experience. But then, after coming back, Azurath kind of started, like, realizing he didn't really know much about the outside world. Like, being in the military was kind of like an eye-opener for him. Like, wow, I don't know what, like, any of this stuff is. So he decided to figure out more of the world. He decided that in order for him to be a good ruler and do the best that he could, that he needed to go out and see how other people worked and lived in the world. So not only could he figure out how to best help, his people, but be able to be fair and just. And his parents thought it was a good idea, and they were going to let him go off on this journey, and he was going to bring nothing. Like, anything that showed he was royalty, nothing. He was just going to be some average Joe, and that was going to be the end of it. Just to kind of make sure that nobody was trying to go after him or hurt him or whatever. Just, if he's just some random guy, he's not going to draw a lot of attention, and nobody's going to try and do anything to him. Now, the cool part about Azurath that I will say is that my friend who's in the campaign with me, or one of my friends who's in the campaign with me, we decided that we wanted to have our characters link together. We really weren't sure how to do it, and as I was writing up my backstory, I told him I thought of the perfect way to have our characters, intertwined. So we decided that his character was going to be like a prisoner of war, so the two nations had been fighting, and that the dwarf cleric, Drak, which is my friend's character, he was going to accompany the prince on his journey, and if he came back alive, then Drak would have his freedom. So that was just kind of like something that we decided to do, and obviously that's not necessary, but we just wanted to have our characters to have some kind of connection. And it's connections like these that can, again, really help us build our characters. So I decided to make it that Azurath knew Dwarvish, because obviously Drak, like I said, is a dwarf cleric. So it would make sense for the two of them to be able to at least speak a similar language to be able to communicate with each other if they didn't want anybody else knowing. After I've bored all of you with Azurath's backstory, I'm going to talk about his ability scores now. So his strength is 20, his dexterity is 16, his constitution is 16, his wisdom is 14, and his charisma is 12. So for a fighter, strength is really important. You're going to want to hit pretty hard, which is why I put it the 20 there. I had constitution again be one of the higher ones too, because it's going to influence my HP. I wanted dex to be high too, because that's going to help me be able to dodge attacks and all that jazz. And I don't really need to worry about charisma too much, because nothing really applies there. Obviously, like I mentioned before, charisma's not going to help me hit things hard, so didn't really need it. And there's intelligence, I'm not going to be casting spells, so didn't really need that to be high either. And this is what I was talking about earlier with a dump stat. You will always kind of have one class who just doesn't really need a certain stat, and you'll have other members of the party who will be able to make up for that loss. Skill-wise, he's proficient in athletics, history, perception, and persuasion. And those were just stuff that, some of them were from his noble background, but some of the stuff I just chose because I thought that seemed pretty fitting for him to know as a fighter, but also kind of as a noble. His personality traits, it's kind of in the middle of Miyumi's and Soraka's, not super fleshed out, but not bullety points. He likes to be fair. As a ruler, you're going to want that. You're going to want your ruler to be just, and you're going to want him to be fair. And he trusts his allies, and he's going to protect them, but only if they need it. So he can look at an ally and say, I trust in your ability to be a good fighter. And he's really only going to go over there if someone else needs assistance. So I'll also kind of talk about some of the cool things about Dragonborn is that they have a damage resistance. So they have a resistance to damage of the type that associated with their draconic ancestry. And so the draconic ancestry is, funny enough, actually influenced by color. So depending on what color you are, depends on what element it is. And if you'll just keep bearing with me as I kind of, just fangirl over my characters, Azurath is a pretty good example of character interactions with your party members, because Drak and Azurath have an actual pretty interesting dynamic, and me and the guy who plays Drak like to kind of go into that a little bit. The two of them are usually by each other, and Drak actively listens to Azurath's commands. And one of the actual flaws I had for Azurath is he tends to lead more than follow, and so it kind of makes sense that Drak would listen to him, because, he kind of is that, nobility, and the party does not know he's royalty. The only one who knows he's royalty is Drak, and Drak hasn't, said anything about it, nor will he, but the two of them can just kind of play off each other. They'll just, even in combat, Drak will just be hey, what do you want me to do? And Azurath will instruct him and say, hey, I think this is what should be done, I think this is what we need to do, and all that stuff. Another thing I do want to add, though, is that sometimes other characters can influence how your character thinks or feels about a certain thing. For example, my human druid had this wizard in her party, and he cast fireball and he rolled a nat 1, and it ended up catching everything on fire. Now, I decided to kind of play off of that, and so since then, Soraka does not trust him with anything fire, and she always has Create Destroy Water prepped, so that's a spell that she can use, and like the name implies, create or destroy water in whatever tile, and be able to use that. Another example of this is how in my Fighter Dragonborn's party, one of the players keeps also rolling nat 1s when we're in combat and almost hits him. Like, this has happened like twice. Not that I'm bitter or upset or anything, what are you talking about? That one of the characters has crit failed and almost hit my character, and it's been like the DM saying, okay, roll me whatever, and based on whatever number he rolls is determined by what, creature character he hits, and I've dodged a bullet twice with this, or I guess I should say dodged an arrow with this twice. So literally it was a ranger with a crossbow or some kind of bow, I think it's actually a bow, that he almost hit me with. So Azurath's starting to really not trust him very much in terms of like being able to hold his own in combat. Like, for example, in that same fight, or at least one of the fights where the ranger crit failed, he ended up getting knocked unconscious. So as soon as he got knocked unconscious, Azurath's like, whoop, someone needs my help, someone's down, someone needs assistance, and just kind of would like run over and help them. By no means am I suggesting that you should hate on the players who keep rolling nat 1s. That's not what I'm suggesting at all. I'm just saying that it's like based on stuff like this that can really help you form a character and be able to help form ideas, opinions about other players in the party, or just how your character is going to act towards other members of the party. So I hope by sharing these experiences and being able to talk about at least my characters and their sheets a little bit and going into a little bit more detail about them, that I've been able to help you guys kind of learn a little bit more about D&D character creation and also how to play characters. That's kind of really what I wanted people to be able to learn from this, is that being able to play a different character is just so cool. Like, again, you get to be you every day. But being able to step outside of that and be able to experience from another perspective in fantasy, it's just so cool. And you get so many awesome memories that you get to just kind of carry with you and like laugh at. Like, oh, hey, remember our one session where so-and-so like almost killed the boss, but then they crit failed and then they ended up tripping over a rock. Like, for example, just stuff like that. It's just something that you can always talk about later and kind of always reminisce about and just have a good time with it. Really, that's what D&D is about. D&D is about being able to have a good time and to also create memories that will last you for a long time. Alrighty, so I think that's gonna do it for me. I hope you all enjoyed me nerding out and talking about D&D. It is probably one of my favorite hobbies that I get to do. I always enjoy being able to get together with my friends and just have a good time, laugh, and roleplay. And I really hope that I've inspired some of you guys to want to do the same. Before I do end, I do want to say that I'm still kind of trying to get a grasp on how I want to do podcast releases. Now, I do want to be able to work at my own pace because that's going to help me bring really good content, and I don't feel like I'm going to have to rush or, oh, well, I need to get this out, so either the quality's going to be bad or things are going to be really short or whatever. So I'm just going to work at my pace, and whenever I get these out, I'll get them out. I'll try not to take too long. Like, I'll try not to take a month or two. I'll try to, maybe, like, max or min, like, probably about, like, 3 weeks. I'll try to, like, do one about every 3 weeks. I think that sounds pretty doable because, like I said, I don't want to do too much at one time. As a lot of my friends know, I do a lot. I'm involved in a lot. I stream 4 days a week. I play in 2 D&D sessions. I DM for 2 D&D sessions. So that already right there is a lot. But I am actually currently job hunting. So at some point, I will hopefully have a job, so that is also going to take a lot of my time. So I just don't want to get too involved in this and promise you guys, like, oh, I'll have a podcast every week or every 2 weeks, and then I won't be able to deliver it on time because I just, life happens and I got a lot going on. So I just want to try and be able to get these out at some kind of like a leisurely pace. Like I said, I'll try for 3 weeks. Once again, though, I cannot stress enough the support that I've been receiving from you guys. It really warms my heart, and I can't thank you enough. You're all amazing and fantastic, and to have you guys as a part of my community has really brightened my life a lot. Like, I don't really know how to put it into words where I would be right now if it weren't for you guys. I will have another poll as to what the next topic of the podcast is going to be. I'm also probably going to have D&D up again, so I can talk about something a little bit different than what I did now, which is just character creation. Could also talk about video games again, which I've already done, but I could also talk about a specific video game. I've heard that some of you actually liked me going in depth about Armello, so maybe having a different video game that I talk about a lot might be useful too, or just maybe some other topic in general. If you do want to catch my live streams, you can catch me over at Twitch. The URL will be at the bottom. But you don't have to. I'm sure some of you are just like, no, please, Soul, I don't want to hear you talk any more than I already have. And that's totally fair. I hate listening to myself talk too. But if you would like to catch my live streams and actually be able to talk with me live, you can do that. That's an option. So click that link down at the bottom. I also have a Patreon. So if you would like to monetarily support me, if not, no big deal. Your support in watching these videos, sharing these videos, or liking, commenting, whatever, is good enough for me. But if you can find it in your heart and you want to financially support me, or at least help financially support me, even just a little bit, I do, again, have a Patreon, and the, I think, lowest tier is like $1 or $2, so not even that big of a deal. And you'll get your name on a little appreciation screen, because I love you. But that'll also be listed. There will be a link down at the bottom below in the description. And yeah, if you want to catch more podcasts or whatever the heck else I decide to put on my channel, then definitely subscribe. You can see all that zany content whenever I am able to get it out and publish it. Of course, if you have any questions that you've just been dying to ask me, feel free to write them down in the comments below. I will get to them in the next podcast. So, alright, I think I'm going to end that off here. And until next time, guys, bye-bye!